Alright gang, so we're going to create a Windows form application, a WinForm, and I've created one. I called it DbQueryForm 2. I've gone through, created this video. The resolution, for whatever reason, was horrible in the previous one that I did. So now all I have is a blank form, and this gets automatically generated when I create a blank WinForm app. Okay, so it's created an instance of a form for me, and it's given it a name, Form 1. So code exists already that has everything to do with it about a form, all the attributes and functionality that could come with a form. So I want to resize this thing to give me a little more space to deal with the things that we're going to add to this form. Okay, so our form is starting out blank, but what we're going to ultimately do is we're going to have a menu on it, and that menu will allow the user to interact with a control that we will add, or controls I should say, that we're going to add to the form itself. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to add the one form, and it's called a table layout panel, or the one tool I should say is a table layout panel. We're going to come over here on the left in our toolbox, and we'll scroll down. Here we go. It says table layout panel. Now, a table layout panel, what it's ultimately going to look like is similar to this menu across the top of my IDE up here. So I'm going to take this table layout panel, and I'm going to drop it on here, and this is going to break my form up into grids. We're going to start out by segmenting this thing out so we can have our section at the top, and then we'll have another section. Our section at the top will be our menu that I was just talking about, and then below that we'll have an area to run a query. And down below that, we'll have three sections. And down below that, we'll have our results of the query. Now, what are we going to query? Well, a query is ultimately a question that's being posed to a database, a table in a database. And our question could be anything that we want it to be. We could actually run a query that changes or modifies the data within that database. Now, my database, and I'll talk about it a little bit later, it's just a simple little database that will allow us to connect to an external drive. Okay, and we'll have an external drive that'll connect to something called employees. So I'll have a database that's called employees, and then we'll go from there. Okay. Give me just a second. Okay, I had to go verify the database that we're actually going to deal with, and it's not going to be what I thought it was. Here, I'll show you the one we're going to deal with. So I've got this database. It's called Customer, and it has a table in it called Full Name, and it has some people in there named whatever we want to call them. So the name of the database will be customer.accdb. And if I want to run a query, it will be on a table named Full Name. So, with that said, let's come back to what we were dealing with. Now, I've got a form object, and then we've also got our table layout panel that we've added on here. Now, the panel allows us to segment out this form. So if I come over here on my right, comes to this table layout panel, we have the ability to dock this thing. How do we want to dock it? Want to fill it. could go at the top. Here's my fill. It's just like that, and all I did was pick that center one, and that gave me a dock fill. Now what that does is stretches this out over the entire form. Essentially, I've broken this form up into 2 columns and 2 rows. Now, I may want more columns or more rows, and we'll come up here in the upper right, and you see this little triangle, or you may call it an arrow, that'll allow us to expand a menu out. Now this menu, we can add a column, add a row, remove the last column, remove the last row. Let's remove the last column. Now we just have 2 rows. Now let's edit rows and columns. So currently, this is what we have. It's saying 1 column, 50%. Well, I don't want, what I really want is just rows. I don't want to deal with more columns. So let's switch this over and we'll deal with rows. Row 1, row 2. Now I want to add a row 3 and add row 4. We'll have a total of 4 rows that we're going to deal with. Let's set our first row. I want it to be absolute at 20 pixels. So I'm saying it's how big it's going to be in height. So we'll go to the second one, and instead of percent, we'll make that one absolute as well at a total of 80 pixels. I'll just go ahead and type that in. Okay, let's go down to the next one, row 3. Change that to percent, and I want it at 50%, and then the last one I'll have it auto size whatever's left. Okay, and we'll go ahead and click OK, and that has added in our rows. We only see 3 of them. The last one will auto size on its own. Okay. So, with that said, next thing we're going to do is we're going to proceed and we're going to deal with this top section here. So the top was for our menu. The next will be our query. And down below in the third will be our output, what comes as a return from our query. Okay, so we're going to need some more objects that we're going to have to drop onto our form. When I say objects, they're instances of controls that we're going to have to pull from the left over here. Now, what control are we going to use? Let's use a menu strip. Let's come over, we'll get our menu strip, and we'll drop that into that top section. Okay? So this top section, we'll go ahead and type in there, for the first one, we'll call it File. Okay, so we got our first menu item is File, and what happens when you click File? Let's go ahead and add in there Exit. Okay, and it's hung up on me for a second. Okay, go Exit. Come over to the next, and we'll say Database. And when it comes to the database, what happens when you click Database? We'll have some options in there. We'll have Connect. We've got that. What else are we going to want to have? We'll have Disconnect as well. And we'll have our next section will be Query. And that should do well for us. I'll stretch this down a little bit so we can see it. So we have file, database, and query. File, if I click it, I get exit. Database, connect, disconnect. And query, I want to have that to say run query. Okay, so we've got the things that we want over here on the side. So for run query, I'm going to want that to have a hotkey for it. And what I mean by that, I want run query that if you clicked run query, so I'm on the menu item, and that's my run query menu item. I want to come down, and down in miscellaneous, I want my shortcut keys. And the key is going to be, let's pick F5. So if you click F5, then it's the same as running that query. Okay, so we'll go ahead and click away, and now we see run query and our F5. That's there for us should we decide that we're going to want to use a little shortcut. And the shortcut key of F5 will get us where we want to be when it comes to running that query. Now, aside from that, let's see, what else are we going to do here? We're building our menu, and we've got exit, connect, disconnect, and let's see, beyond that, we want to run the query. I think we're doing good so far. Okay, so now we're going to have to think about the logic of what's going to take place here. Now, the exit will allow us to shut down our form and get out. The connect will allow us to connect to the database, and the disconnect will allow us to get away from it or disconnect from it. Query will actually execute our query, and F5 will also allow us to execute the query. Okay, so with that said, let's go ahead and we'll proceed from here. Okay, now we're going to add some code in behind to get our code where we want it to be. And the easiest way to get into our code is, let's start out with the run query. We'll just double click on run query. And here's our code, and this is a click event associated with that object. We'll go back to the form, database, double click connect, back to the form, double click disconnect, back to the form, and we'll go over to this other menu item, exit, and now this is whatever happens if we click that exit in the tool strip. So, that said, let's start out with the easiest part. And the easiest part of this is, if you click exit, what do you want to have happen? I'll type in app, and I want application dot, and there's some functionality associated with this whole application, and I want the exit method to get called. I've got to terminate that. So if I ran this now, and we'll go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and run it and see what happens. I start it. My form's going to go ahead and run. It'll pop up for me, and we'll see that menu item there. Now, I don't have any code associated with the other objects or the other controls on that menu. All right, so right now, the only thing we've got going on our menu, and there we go, we've got database, there's connect, disconnect, query, we can run that query. If I click it, nothing happens. If I click File, Exit, it's going to run or execute this method, the exit method. And that'll shut us down. So that's working the way that we want it to work. All right? So we're good to go so far. And what we're going to do is we need to think about what's going to happen when we run this query. When we run this query, we're going to have on our form, back over here, in this area, we've got to have some destination for that data. Okay, now what is that destination? What is it that we want? Well, let's go over and look at our menu. Let's say, well, you know, I've got a text box, and I can drop a text box right there. And there's my text box. And that text box can hold whatever it is that I want to display. Now, I've got to think beforehand what it is about this text box that I want to put in here. Now, this text box, I come over and I expand this thing out. I got to make sure that it sits in this space and takes up all my space. So if you think back to what we did, we took this layout and we docked it in the form. We're going to take this text box. It's got focus, so we can come over here on the right and we say, well, when it comes to this, let's come down to dock. How do we want to dock it? We want to dock it the same way that we docked our layout. Okay? So now we've docked this thing, and it's taking up the whole width. I want to make it multi-line, so we're going to come up and we're going to make this thing multi-line so that we can have it extend. There we go. Multi-line. We'll change it to true. Now, by default, it was just a single line. When we docked it and converted it to a multi-line text box, it expands out as big as it can within the space that it has. So it's ready to receive whatever text we type into it. Okay, so at this point, we've got our menu. We've got where the text is going to get received. It's called text box 1. That's where we're going to display our text. Okay, so then I should say type our text in. That's our input. Now, where are we going to display what's getting returned? So let's look over at our toolbox, and in our toolbox, I want to do a data grid view. So I'll come up, there it is, data grid view, and I'll drop that in there. Okay. And our data grid view, it's there in this last piece or last bit of our layout. I don't remember what we had to do over here. Let's come down. And we'll dock it the same way we did before. There we go. So what's being returned by our query from the database, the results, or the answer we get for our question, will get returned into this last space. And we've docked a few things here. We've docked the whole layout onto the form. We've docked the text box into that one cell, and we've docked our our data grid view into this last section. Okay, so at this point, if I run this thing, I can not do a whole lot because I don't have any functionality built in here. Okay, I can resize this thing as big as I want when I'm running it, and if I expand file and click exit, it will shut down the application. It will cease it to run. Okay. Okay, so let's jump in behind our code. We've already got this much to go on. I'll go ahead and minimize this bottom. It's an auto hide down here, and let's look at our code. So here, to go ahead and initialize, I'm going to jump up in front of this. Give me some space here, and I want to start out by creating a string. Okay, and this string, I'm going to call it my con string. And when I say con string, it's my connection string. Okay, but I gave it a name that's very explicit, let me know what it is. We get in the habit of doing it a certain way. So the provider, we'll start out with that attribute, and the provider is going to be Microsoft.ace.oledb.12.0 semicolon. The next attribute we've got to deal with is our data source. Where are we going to find the database? Okay, and we're looking at our D drive, and I think that's the drive that I'm dealing with. Yep, I'm dealing with my D drive. So on my D drive, D colon, and I go backslash. What was the name we were going to deal with? It was customer. So it's customer.accdb. And in the book, they tell you a certain way of dealing with this, and I hate to say it, but I don't always do the things the same way the book does. So I've got a different way of dealing with security here. The way I deal with it is persist security info equals false. End it with a semicolon, and there's my string. Okay? There's my string. Now, for some reason it's saying it's expecting something that I'm not giving it. We'll deal with that later. We'll come on down. I'll do another string. Call Q, and I'll initialize it with nothing. And just want to make sure I don't see any issues in here. Yeah, that all looks good. So we've got our string Q. We'll deal with that later. Another string, and I normally would just add this in. We may not use error message in this video, but I'll go ahead and declare it by default. And we'll declare a variable, and it's, let's see, it's not coming up by default for me. OLADB connection con equals no. Now, remember what I'm missing, and the reason this is happening is, let's come back up here, and we've got to add a little line in here. Using system, get into data, OLED, there we go, OLEDB. Okay, and that got us here, our OLEDB connection. It's thinking it has a problem up there, but it really doesn't. So we've declared the variables that we need to declare. We've got our initialization, and let's come down to let me think here. Well, let's start out with our click events. So we've got connection, and we've got our disconnect. So let's start out with our connect. Now, our connect, go ahead and use what we did in chapter 11 with our try, open and close. Come down after that, we'll do our catch, open and close, and my catch, I'm going to catch exception. Go EX, and if I do have an issue, I want it to pop up with a message box. I want it to actually show the message box. I want that message box to display exactly whatever the error or issue was. Okay, so we're going to try to connect to the database. If it doesn't work, it's going to let me know what the problem was. So that'll get us our initial connection. So what are we going to do to make that connection? Let's declare a connection. So we do con equals, we need a new OLADB connection. There we go. And I want to pass that connection con string. Okay. So in essence, what we're doing is we're creating a connection to the database. And it's an instance, we're calling it con. It's an instance of an OLADB connection. So our con, when we go to do it, when we open our con, or our connection, it will go ahead and use that string that we have up above, so it knows how to connect to it, what it's connecting to, and where it is, and how to deal with security. So that's what we've got going so far. Come down, let's look at the next one. And we need to go ahead and open that connection. scroll down, con.open. And what I want to do is, if this thing actually opens up, let me know that it's working. So I'll copy this message box. Now I don't want an error message. I want it to tell me connection open. Just to let me know something's happening. Because if that doesn't happen, I would just assume that I connected, but I don't really know that it did. Now, one of the things I need to take into account is once I've connected, I don't want to allow the system to try to connect again. So I want to turn off or disable that menu item. Now that's our connect toolstrip menu item. So we're going to say connect toolstrip menu item. Now which item functionality do we want? Well, it's enable. I want to turn it from enabled to, bear with me, from enabled, there we go, there's enabled equals false. So it's no longer enabled. Let's come over here, next line, and we'll say our disconnect menu item dot enabled equals true. So essentially what I did was I turned off the connect option and I turned on the disconnect option. Okay, now beyond that, let's assume at this point that I've connected. I've got a connection to the database. It popped up, gave me a little message and said, we've connected. Now, anytime I open something, I need to make sure that I close it. Okay? So, I'm going to copy this section of code. I'm going to come down here to the disconnect, and I don't want to connect to this thing again. And instead of con.open, I want con.close. So my disconnect, I'll close the connection. Little message that says connection closed. And we'll change these statuses, swap them to true, and the other one to false. So we just did everything the opposite direction. So disconnect, close the connection, said we closed it, and then toggled the menu items, turning them on and off. Now, okay, what do we have left that we've got to deal with? Well, got a little bit left. Let's see if this thing actually runs. We'll go ahead and start it. It says I've got an error. I know what my error is already. And it's saying that I've got a comma expected. Let's see if it'll actually connect. It's not letting me connect at this point. Go ahead and exit. Okay. Now I'm seeing where my issue was, and I forgot an equal sign in there, and that made that go away. So it wouldn't let me connect. Let's go back in. Little things like that, and the first one to say I'm not perfect when it comes to what we're doing. So it runs, fires up, and let's go ahead and see if it'll let us connect. It says I've got a connection open. Click OK. Let's come back over here and look. And if we look, the connect is now no longer enabled. Nothing happens when I click on it, but I can click disconnect, and let's see what happens when I click disconnect. Jump into our try block, connection closed. So it's allowing us to connect to the database and disconnect from the database. So we're doing okay when it comes to that so far, and we already know that we've got our exit functionality. Okay, so it's letting us connect to the database, and it's letting us disconnect from the database. So let's come on down, and we're going to look at this block of code right here. Run query tool strip. So this is our run that query section. Now, what is it that's going to happen when we actually run our query? Now, we've got to connect to the database first. So we're assuming that's already happened. We're going to deal with Q. Q equals, and I want to come back. I want to change something real quick here. Let's go back and look. We've got this box right here. That was our text box. And our text box we're going to pass that, whatever's in it, we're going to pass that to our connection. So I'm going to come over here, and I want to change the name of this. There it is, name. Instead of text box 1, we're going to call it query box 1. Okay? It's not just a normal text box. It's a query box. Okay? I'm going to go back and I'm going to look into my code. And there we go. I've got query box 1 dot text. So I'm assigning the value of query1.text to the object Q. Okay? And beyond that, we'll go ahead and we're going to do our try block. And after our try block, we always want to have catch block. And our catch block, I want to do the same thing that we always do. So I'll just copy that whole section of code there for our catch block. I'm going to do the same thing. Let me know what the error was if I had to catch one. And we're going to use an OLEDB command. Now we don't have one yet, so we're going to have to create one. It comes up first. There it is, OLEDB command. We'll call it CMD. We'll equal a new OLEDB command. And we're going to put parentheses, and we're going to pass it Q and con. Okay? Q and con. Q being whatever was in that text, and con is the connection that we're dealing with. Well, that connection is open. I could have more than one connection open at a time, but that's the connection that we have open, and I'm using that connection to run this query. So I pass that query through that connection to the database. We need to create an adapter. So we'll get our OLEDB data adapter. We'll call it A. and it's a new LADB data adapter. I want to pass it that command that we just created above. We'll come down to the next line, and I need to create a data table, and it essentially is where am I going to put this data that I received. Now, I'll come down a little bit. There we go, data table. We'll call it DT equals new. It goes default to data table. I've declared where I'm going to put this stuff when I receive it. So now, my adapter, what is it that I'm going to deal with? I want a select command equals CMD. All right. From there, I'm going to take that adapter. We're going to fill. And what are we going to fill? We're going to fill that data table that we created. So I'm going to take the results of my adapter, and that's getting the data from my command through the adapter. What are we going to do with what it gives us? We're going to dump it into that data table. So now DT is getting filled up with results. Now I need to back up. I haven't changed the name on that yet. Let's go back. We're going to take this bottom object and we're going to call it results, because that's where we're putting our results, a data grid view. Come down and name it. Results. I renamed that data grid view. I called it results because that's where I'm putting my results. Now when I say results, it recognizes it. Dot. I'm going to deal with data source. So where's the source for our output? What we're going to display? It's that data table that we created. Okay, and we're going to go ahead and resize that thing. And I want to auto resize the columns to adapt to whatever it is that gets returned, and that's a method. You need to go ahead and run it that way. So I've got my command. Adapter is going to handle what's coming back. I'm going to format what I get. That'll pass it into data grid. All right, looks like we're running good. Let's go ahead and run this thing and see what we get. Okay, so it's running. It says it's got a problem because I never used something that I had in my code. So let's see here. Select all from full name. Select everything from a table called full name. Well, let's go ahead and connect. We've got our connection. Run the query, and it did it. It connected to our database, and it returned whatever was there in that database, item by item. Gave us everything that existed in that table, full name. Okay, we can come back up, disconnect, and then we can close our object. So it's working at this point. We can go pretty it up a little bit and deal with some things that, what happens if we I'm going to change something. I'm going to change things up a little bit, and what I want to do is I did everything in that tool strip menu. I'm going to do this a little bit different. Let's come up above, and we're going to do our own little query. Let's call it private. It's not going to return anything. We're going to call it run query. Open it up, we'll close it. Now, run query, I want to take everything from that menu and I want to put that in our run query. And in our menu, instead, we're going to play with our cursor a little bit. And let's start out with this dot, get our cursor. What do we want our cursor to do? It'll equal, go look at the cursors that we have, dot, which cursor we're going to deal with? It's the weight cursor. And then we'll go ahead and run that query that we just created above. And then once it's done running, we'll change it back to this dot cursor equals cursors dot default. What is it? What did he just do? All right, let's go back and look at this. We know it works because we just did it. We just moved around where we did the work. So instead of it being in that menu, let's go ahead and do our connection. It connected. Good there. We'll come over, run the query. Command text was not set for the command object, meaning we didn't have our query. Select all from, and what was the name of it? I think it was full name. It's a little f. Go ahead and run it again, and it did it, but it happened so fast that we didn't even see it. Didn't have time to change the cursor on us. So ideally, we would see that weight. It's a little hourglass moving. Now, since it's a local database and my system is pretty fast, we didn't see anything take place in there. Okay, but we would have that weight cursor in there just so we could see what's taking place. We'll disconnect, and we'll go ahead and exit. Now, what do we have left? We've got to think ahead to think about what if somebody doesn't do what they should have done. Okay? What happens if somebody did what forgot to do what they should have done along the way? Now, we've got the ability to go look at different functionality of what we've got. So if I have this thing running, let's assume, and I say it time and time again, we assume our users are not doing what they're supposed to be doing. So let's assume that the user clicks database, he opens the connection, he runs his query, but he forgets to disconnect from the database. Well, how do we deal with that? How do we deal with if they just, I just click and exit out? The connection can potentially persist, and I don't want that to happen. I don't want to have a database tied up because my code is not working the way that it's supposed to be working. So let's go ahead and we're going to look at behaviors associated with this form. So this form will come over, and there's what happens when it loads, and here's what happens when it closes. And I'm going to double click in there, and this is an event associated with that form closing. So when the form closes, what do I want to have happen? If somebody just goes up and clicks that X in the upper corner of the form and never disconnects the database, what do we have happen? Well, we've got to think about that. Let's go ahead and treat it as if when that form closes, it automatically causes that disconnect toolstrip menu item dot to do what? Perform click. We want it to automatically act as if somebody clicked that thing for us if the person does that. Okay? So I'll go ahead and start this thing up, and now I'm safe to where if I connect, connection's open, I see that it's still working. I can disconnect if I want to, but what if somebody comes over here and closes that? Connection closed. So if you try to close this form, it'll close that connection before the form gets closed. We're cleaning up after ourselves by doing the code this way. Okay? So we've got our database connection. There's things we can do that we've dealt with in the past to go pretty this up. If I look at my form, I can change the name of the form. I can change the sizing of it. I want to allow auto resize. I want the users to be able to resize this if they want to. I could disable some of this functionality if I wanted to. It does, we're looking at function first before form. It does what it's supposed to. Our menu items function, they work. They let the user know what's happening, what's not happening. They allow us to run a query, any query that we enter in this text box, and it returns the results to our data grade. Okay? So that's it. I'm hoping that the resolution's a lot better on this one than it was on our last, and I'll see you soon.